The Netherlands claim to have over 600 museums within their borders. Not only do they have the quantity to make such a boast, but they also have the quality. This week, I'm going to be building a world-class museum district right here in the fictional Dutch city of Noevorden. But I can't just throw buildings up and hope for the best. Every structure needs to fit perfectly into the landscape and feel like it's always belonged there, and this will require mixing some of the old with some of the new. So I'll talk you through the assets and the mods to help pull this off. And while I'm at it, I'll also be expanding the public transit system with some new modes of transit, also at the same time continuing to build housing and keeping a steady flow of citizens into the city. Last week in episode 1, I really wanted to focus on setting up the big transport networks, all while simultaneously creating a neighbourhood around those networks. The aim was to install some big landmark buildings and plenty of open space, whether that's through the creation of parks, or just simply giving some wide walkways or gathering areas for our Sims. I want to expand that theme today somewhat, and as I mentioned earlier, public transport will continue to be a focus, but I definitely want to keep creating those open spaces as well. This episode should feel like a natural expansion of the previous one. As the city grows, we'll have an opportunity to dive into the older and some of the newer parts of the city. We'll be hinting at some of that today through the asset choice, and we'll deal with the challenges that'll present as we go through it on each episode. But first, I want to revisit a few things from that previous episode. The first potential adjustment that I wanted to have a look at was over at the train station. Now, we've used these net lanes already just outside the train station, but I wanted to see if they would actually work on the actual platform themselves. Found it a little bit jarring that we had that sort of dirt texture, and then it was kind of going into the concrete texture that comes with the station itself. So using a net lane, I'm just going to grab some of the nodes and then raise them. As you've probably seen there as I was talking, you can see that it will in fact cover the train station tracks, which is pretty cool. So we're going to use move it again. We're going to select our individual nodes, and then we're just going to use the to object height. And here you can see it's actually filled the train track in its entirety with the net lane, which is sweet. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat that process on all of the tracks, and we should have something that looks a little bit more cohesive. And there we go. I think that's looking a little bit more like it. Perfect. Now that takes us on quite nicely to the next thing I want to have a look at, and that is these train tracks leading under through the tunnel. I definitely want to have a big focus on public transport here, and obviously train is going to be a big part of that. I'd like to add more lanes and really kind of up the capacity, and what I wanted to do is to see if I could just replace and upgrade what was there already, and as you can see, well, you can't. So I think this is going to be a demolish and rebuild job, I reckon, for another day. The next little adjustment was revisiting our parking. If you can remember on episode 1, if you've watched it, then the traffic couldn't turn right. They were in fact turning left, run down the pavement and then rejoining the road. So the only solution to that was really just to remove that building and put something else in instead. So I'm just going to put a couple of the row homes in there, and I think it's a pretty good fit. Around the back, I'll just extend the sort of industrial look. That's the kind of service block where we have our parking and fire station, and we've got our little tram depot and a few other bits and pieces, and I think maybe a little industrial unit around the back of here is going to be a reasonable fit as well. Now, although it's tucked away in a hidden part of the city, I don't want to sort of just dump it and forget about it here. We'll give it a little bit of love and attention. So first things first, let's just pop down a surface so it looks like it should be part of the city, and next we're going to use a selection of decals and graffiti, and we're going to add to the graffiti that's in this sort of area here already, and it should kind of look like it's part of the same build, right? There we go. That's not a bad little bit of detailing for a little side road that we'll probably never look at again. The next thing I wanted to do was to actually look at the main road surfaces. I didn't use any surface on the actual asphalt or the concrete road surfaces, and here I've used generic lemons. Excellent surface for roads, but I'm not too sure, to be honest, if I'll keep it or not. I think having it vanilla actually didn't look too bad, and although this adds a bit of grain and a bit of texture, I don't know if it's going to be worth doing a whole city with it. It's one for a debate, I guess. What do you guys think? I'll leave it with you. Next thing on the hit list is getting rid of these 60 markers on the roads. I think what I'd like to do is actually change the actual speed limit on the road. I did have a look for a mod that would do that, and it looked like it was broken. Don't know if you can do it on Road Builder. I don't have the game loaded up right now, so this may be something I'll check next time I'm on. But yeah, these roads you would expect to be, I guess, probably a 30mph limit, right? So obviously we have a bit of a problem with our electricity, so let's have a quick look at our power station. That was slotted in quietly in episode 1, and I didn't show it off because, well, it's not really much to show off. I reckon before this thing burns down completely, we're going to have to add some fire services here, aren't we? Things are escalating, but the fire service is on the scene, helicopters busy dropping water, and we've got all of our fire trucks jumping straight in there, so I reckon we should be okay. Everything's getting under nice and control. We've got some of the fire services actually leaving the site now, and obviously we've just got a few bits of smoke still on the go. Okay, wasn't expecting that. I guess we have to rebuild it. So now that we've dealt with a few minor adjustments and the small matter of a nuclear disaster, it's time to really get cracking on with the build. So one thing you maybe notice here on this shot is that you can see that we have some linear development along the arterials in the build. Now that was really put in as a temporary stopgap, and it's more for me to be able to get some nice screenshots and that kind of stuff and cinematics at the end of the video. Once we kind of build out towards them areas, you'll find that I'm going to be deleting a lot of those buildings and we're going to get them replaced, and that's exactly what we're doing here today. So the development area in this build is going to very much be around this junction and another one that's going to be a bit further to the right of the screen. Unfortunately, we've had to kick a lot of people out, but I'm hoping they can come back. We're going to build them a nice say, and I reckon they'll be back shortly. So job number one here is just to stretch out the interchange, or the intersection rather, and we'll give our trams a little bit of an easier turn in and out of this section. This corner is going to feature a bit of a transport plaza, I guess is the way to describe it. It's going to have a few different modes of transport. We're going to have a tram. We're going to add some subway here. Obviously, I'm not doing the whole line because we only have one little section of the city. And I would like at least some space for some bus stops here as well. And I think it will give us a nice additional sort of transport hub, or mini hub, I guess, for the city. So I've opted for another three-way intersection here, and we are actually going to extend that and do trams only again on this side. Now I am trying to stick to as many sort of three-way interchanges, or intersections rather, as I can. This arterial road is going to be super busy, and you don't really see these roads too much in Netherlands, as a good few of you have pointed out in the comments, but it's going to be necessary. I talked about that in episode 1. It's going to be super busy, and sometimes it gets pretty busy. We've only got 7,000 people here. I reckon by the time we're finished out building this island, we're going to be in excess of 100,000. It's going to be super busy, and I think we're going to have some problems with traffic later down the line. So as much transit absolutely everywhere is going to be the order of the day for this build. Now, although I've talked about transit and we've done a little bit of road work and we've done a little bit of tram work, this chapter isn't really about that. It's about getting some of the bigger buildings in and really getting a feel for the scale of things and try and get an image in my mind on how things are going to turn out in the end result. One thing I wanted to create here was a little custom tram station. Now, this, I couldn't find really anything like it in the Netherlands, but I found some really nice examples actually in Poland and Switzerland, and I guess even Manchester has a big canopy on their trams as well, part of Victoria Station, which is obviously a much bigger scale. Across the road, I'm actually going to use a UK asset. Again, this is with the hospital one, similar to what we used down the road on the main intersection. And here we're going to just use some of the extensions, put them together, and we're going to sort of build this up and make it look a little bit fancier. Inspiration for this one is going to come from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And across the road from that, I'm going to build a modest and maybe a little bit more modernist museum as well. So I'm going to just plop it down for now, but we're going to make a bit of a feature of that modern one as well. Before I put down any more buildings though, I just need to do a quick adjustment here on the intersection. I want to make sure that we don't have any weird, mad U-turns on our trams, and I think that is looking okay. Now our big fancy museum is going to get a modern upgrade. I'm actually going to use this little asset from the Dutch post office, and we're going to create a little bit of an extension up here on the roof, and I think that looks like a fairly decent modern extension. I think we can get away with that one. On the opposite side of the intersection from those two museums, I'm going to create a little bit of a courtyard, and we're going to have a little bit of an older building, I guess, in here as well. And I think this is going to really just start the mark of the transition from this neighbourhood into what's going to be the more historic district. Inspiration from this one comes from the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam as well. Now, I couldn't really find an asset that was going to go with that, and what I decided to do was to try and bring it down actually in scale and make a bit of a smaller version of it. I'm going to use a couple of the EE assets here in the middle, and these smaller ones, you know, the courtyards, these are part of the UK pack as well. So we're going to continue to kind of mix and match and combine things and try and get some interesting neighbourhoods, you know. To complete the big buildings here, I'm going to use the Seven Hills residence. I'm not sure if this is a vanilla or part of the Mediterranean heritage. It kind of looks like Mediterranean heritage, doesn't it? But I'm going to recolor it, and this will really just bump up the heights and bump up the densities. Now this might look a little bit out of place for now, but I think this view shows kind of what I'm looking to achieve. And remember, those buildings at the behind there on that particular view, they're all going to go. They're going to be replaced with something a bit more appropriate. So as you can see here, I've just went and grabbed a couple more of the UK assets, the extensions, and I reckon that pretty much completes that particular part of the build for that museum. We're going to build out a nice fancy garden around that. It should look just the part. I'm going to quickly just connect these last buildings to the roads. We get rid of all these error messages. These buildings actually contain a ton of housing for Sims, and this would be a really busy little intersection in fact. So one thing to note on this section now is that we have a good base to build off. We've got 5 potential museum candidates, we've got the beginnings of what will be a transport plaza, and I think we've got a ton of space to work with as well. So let's have a quick look and then we can move on to the next section. This chapter is going to cover connections. The aim for this city is to have many points of convergence for transit. So where we have a subway perhaps, or where we have a tram station or a bus stop, I want to have other modes of transport really within short walking distance and give our Sims plenty of options to get around the city with whatever method that they choose to do so. But in addition to that, I want to make sure that everything is nice and walkable. So where we have the options, we're going to be adding paths, we're going to be adding pedestrian walkways, and some of the buildings that we're using, the shells, we're using StarQ's ploppable assets here, which are not functional buildings. I at least want to try and sort of direct pedestrians through them, so they will look like they've got a bit of life. Now, as the city grows and we build out, I maybe look to add some of the service blocks or the zonable blocks, into them, but it's going to be a wee bit different, or a wee bit difficult, I should say, rather, because we're not necessarily going to have road access, to these buildings. So we'll try and figure that out, as the build progresses. So for this part of the city, I think it makes sense to use the underground subway. I look to have an extensive network, and this is basically just going to be one stop on that network. Around the back of that, I want to connect trams. Now again, that's going to head off towards our old town or our historic district, but again, that's something for later down the line. Surface wise, I'm just going to use the one that comes with the actual subway itself. I think that looks pretty good, and we're going to make the most of that, and we're going to try and repeat some of the style of asset that actually comes within that particular subway asset as well. Nice bit of prop work here, I think, with the custom bike racks. We'll put plenty of them down in here, and hopefully we get bikes sooner rather than later. On the other side there, you can see that I've used just the subway prop, so there's only going to be one station here, but I think adding maybe an extra exit looks pretty good. So I'm repeating the style here again. I'm using some of the skate park assets here. Obviously you can find that in the Find It mod. Now I had a few questions about mods and all that kind of stuff in the comments last section as well. If you want to check out the full mod list that I use, just jump on the Discord. For every build that I do, I pretty much put an updated mod list on there. It comes as a text file now, so you can go in and just look at the list if there's a particular mod that you're looking to find. Or if you use Skive, and if you're playing with mods, you should absolutely be managing your mods through Skive, 100% recommended. It also includes a JSON file as well, so you can literally just copy that file into your Skive application and it will build a brand new playlist exactly the same as what I'm using here directly into Skive. So yeah, if you want that, guys, just jump on the Discord, it's free. But if you have any questions about anything that you see here and you're not 100% sure, just ask in the comments. If there's a question on there, I always do try and respond to questions. I might not be the quickest in the world in responding, but I do try and get through them, especially if somebody's asking me something. If you're looking to dive into the build a little bit further, then I do share the game save for Patreon members, so check out that link if you want to have a little look. Tons of game saves. Early access on some of the videos when I can. Obviously you'll get a shout out in the video like these legends, and very occasionally I do share an odd little sneak peek of the build upcoming on the channel as well. So great way to support the channel, do check it out if that's the kind of thing you're interested in. So as we get through this particular chapter, you can see that it's not just about connections, it's also about making this a living, breathing part of the city as well. So there's actually quite a bit of detailing involved, and it's taking quite a bit of time to get through it. One thing I do want to try and sort of incorporate in the build as well is to just try and slot in just as many parks as I can as well. Here we've got a kind of kids park. All we're going to do is just customize that by changing the surface underneath it. And this surface, I think, if I remember correctly, is part of El Gendo's French pack, so do check that out. Pretty cool. That's the same pack that we're using as the red surfaces on here as well. Now that I've said that out loud, it could be the German pack, I'm not too sure, but just go ahead and download them all. They're all pretty good, to be honest, and you can mix and match and find the ones that fit into your city. So there's plenty of prop work going to be going into this particular series, and I reckon what I'll probably do is focus on the main build area, the main point of interest, and then what we do is we just build out a kind of neighbourhood behind it. There's a huge amount of land to build on in this city, and it's going to take quite some time. If I detail up every single street, then I'll never get anything built. But that said, it does give me a nice excuse to leave a little bit of detail to come back to later on. And I always want to try and kind of do some live streams, and I never ever find the time to do it. But I reckon if I'm making progress on the main build on a live stream, I think it's potentially going to give me a little bit more impetus to actually put my finger out and do some more. So I reckon that's going to be the plan for this series going forward. Now, the building that I'm focusing on here, this tall one that uses the French college asset, I kind of think of that as perhaps maybe a gallery of modern art or something like that. I guess it's got a little bit more of a contemporary feel compared to the stuff that's around it. And of course, we've got the really old one next door with the courtyard, and that I kind of imagine might be like maybe a museum of Netherlands life, in the past years. So that's my imagination going. But if you've got some other ideas, just drop them in the comments. Obviously, I'd like to hear them. But plenty of detailing, plenty of walkability, and by the time I finish up on this chapter, really most of the work that needs to be done to make this side of the road looking like a proper city should be wrapped up. So what I'll do then is I will crack on with that, and I'll catch up with you at the end of this chapter. So if the last chapter was all about getting the main building blocks put in place, I think this chapter was about bringing it together. We now have at least the road-facing part of the transit plaza pretty much complete. I think what I'll probably look to do is maybe have a look and see if we can try and add a few more invisible paths and try and get some pedestrians walking through. Now you may have noticed at the beginning of the episode that it wouldn't let me use the pedestrian paths to actually cross the tram tracks. So potentially I might have a look and see if we can crisscross it with invisible paths. Not sure if it will work or if we're going to have the same issue, but I think it's going to be worth having a little experiment and seeing what happens. I'm quite excited to get a metro line at least started here. Well, maybe not a line started, but we've got a station started. I think it's going to be really crucial to get people around here. As I said, it's going to get super busy in this part of the city, and we are going to use all the tools at our disposal to minimise any of these issues. So I reckon stage 1 of the streetscape detailing is looking pretty good. Let's crack on, switch our attention to the other side of the road, and we're going to build out the rest of our museum district. Now before swinging our attention across the road, I wanted to try and address the petrol station asset that we have here as our tram stop. We've got a real nice asset here on the train station ticket machines, and I thought that was going to be a real sweet addition, but it's going to cause me a little bit of a problem, but we'll get back to that a little bit later on in the episode. Just now, as I said, we're going to go back over and we're going to try and show a couple of museums on this side of the road a little bit of love and attention. Now this museum is the sort of fancy one if you like, and really I wanted to give some sort of nice ornate gardens as well. Again, nice big open space, proper tourist attraction, and obviously we're going to decorate it and detail it as such. So I really wanted to try and provide a good bit of contrast in the built environment, and that's why I'm picking a real diverse mix of architectural styles and scale. The next few minutes is essentially going to be detailing, but what I'm going to do, rather than sort of talk my way through it, I'm going to pop up on the screen the individual mods that I'm using to create the scene. Now there should be a nice little mix of landscaping, prop work, surfaces, net lanes. There's quite a bit of a mix here, so I'm going to try and cover as much as I can. And as I said earlier in the video, if you have any questions or I've missed anything out, just ask in the comments and I'll try and get them over to you. Now, it's time to switch our attention to the museum next door. The asset I'm using for this is part of the Northeast US region pack. It's one of the hospital assets, I believe, or maybe one of the hospital upgrades in fact, and I'm going to combine that with a ploppable, one of the EU commercial assets. I think it works pretty well. We'll get it recolored, and I want this to be very much a more modern structure. As part of the same complex, I'm going to combine it with, again, another one of the US region pack assets. I'm not sure which one of the region packs it is, I'll be honest with you, this one, but it is one of the commercial assets. I think it's maybe one of the diners, and again, we'll get it recolored and we'll match it with the existing building that we have beside it. So the thinking for this museum is to obviously add something a bit more modern, and the way I look at this one is perhaps maybe as a memorial museum, a place to remember the fallen, and perhaps we'll maybe add a couple of features that are maybe unique to this particular one, and provide our Sims an opportunity for maybe some quiet reflection. Well, as quiet as they can beside that big road, right? Up next, and directly beside the museum, I am going to build out some of the same sort of buildings that we've used already in the building. I'm not too sure, I might keep it, I might get rid of it. I think potentially we have a little bit of redevelopment, and the nice thing again about these assets, and I mentioned briefly on the previous episode, is that they tend to blend in pretty well and zone in pretty well, so removing them later on isn't really a huge task if we want to try and rebuild it and maybe reissue it with something that's a little bit different. One thing I will try to do, especially where we have our sort of centre or our point of interest, in the build, is to try and add a wee bit more diversity in terms of the built environment. So again, we saw a little bit in the last episode where we slotted in some of the Chinese pack and some of the Eastern European and some of the German, and I'm going to do that again. Get it recolored, and we'll kind of blend it into the rest of the block, and it should look the part. But it does break things up a little bit visually in terms of the continuation of the same sort of assets, and I think it makes the scene look a little bit more interesting. So the first sort of unique feature on this build is to just add a couple of elevated walkways. Now what I'm going to do is add a bit of water as well. I think that makes sense. We'll get it all sort of boxed off if you like, and we'll make the most of these net lanes with the hedges, which kind of makes sense, right? Now, along the pedestrian zone that we have surrounding this development, I'm going to use Crypto Gamer's path networks one more time. I'm going to use the lines that we have sort of built into the path, and these are just vanilla pedestrian paths. We're going to use the lines that are created on the intersections from each path, and I'm going to use that to create something a little bit more unique. Now, the reason that I'm using that particular path is that I'm essentially using it as a bit of a memorial path. So I like to think that perhaps we have the names of the fallen on the actual path itself, and that's something that you'll see sort of throughout the world. There was a bit of an overgrown garden there, right up against the main road, and I ended up deciding to take that out and replace it with some contemporary benching, and again, a little bit of a gathering place and perhaps a moment to sit down and think about things. We use Move It, adding a little bit of height, just adds a bit of interest to that path. I reckon a little bit later in the build we have some scope to use a bit more props on the main road itself or the main path, but for now we'll just leave that. One thing I did want to do was just change the grass. I think it looked a little bit too bright for where it was. I decided to use the Terrain Surface Pack by Gaga, and this gives us a real nice selection of grass surfaces and whatnot, and then you can combine them. They're kind of semi-transparent, so you can sort of mix and match and get the look that you're wanting. But I'm not going to go too crazy on this. I want it to look sort of reasonably looked after and well kept, but a little bit of extra colour doesn't do any harm. So we can just take a minute, step back, and just have a check how things have sort of worked out. And you can see really the size of the development here is definitely grown. We've kind of got a reasonable bit in the neighbourhood done, and a lot of the work here is detailing and bringing that sort of cityscape out away from the main build, or the main road rather, and out towards the main districts and suburbs. So one thing in review, I think perhaps I could have maybe got away with spacing them out a little bit more, but I reckon that, we've got a sort of reasonably compact district, and I think if we've got any tourists here in the area, then they don't have to work too hard, I guess, to go from one place to the other. Now that we have most of the museum work and the attraction work done, now it's time to really focus on expanding this part of the city. Remember, the idea here is to build something interesting, build the points of interest, and then sort of build around it. So really I'm just going to expand the neighbourhood that we've already built on episode 1. We'll be creating a good number of blocks, and I really want to try and push as many Sims into the city as possible early doors. I thought it'd be worth to take a minute and just zoom out for a second and just check on progress. So So obviously it doesn't look like we've added a huge amount, but obviously a lot of that work is street level and detailing stuff. I'm going to show you an after shot at the end of the chapter, and you might be surprised with just exactly how much we've added. Now I'm going to be fairly brutal in editing this particular part of the video. A lot of it is pretty repetitious, and I want to try and avoid that in the videos as much. One thing I will be doing though is I'll be using a little bit of recolor. I think when we have a look on the maps, we kind of get that sort of gentle variation between blocks, and I want to sort of recreate this a little bit here in the video today. So I'd very much like to change the colour ever so slightly on the brickwork and also the roofs as well. And then what we'll do is we'll just sort of paint it, if you like, and make the whole block and give it a little bit of a more uniform look, which I think it looks pretty decent. A little bit of artwork on some of the gable ends in these buildings I think is worth it. And what we can do is we can just zone up, and then we just shift stuff into place, and we fill gaps with using Find It. I think one of the challenges in this build is to try and get things, especially in the back streets, try and get things looking nice and compact. So did a little bit of an experiment here. I'm going to use some one-way streets. I'm going to mix it up with a few different parking options, and we can have a little look, and once we get the surfaces and net lanes or whatever in there, we can have a proper look and see how things look. I decided to add an extra little museum piece at the end there, and I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to create a bit of a courtyard. Not this part, this is just taking care of what's behind the main building, behind the main intersection, but rather this part here instead. I don't think I'll necessarily keep this. What I wanted to do is just build something out and kind of get a feel for how it looked and how it's going to sort of transition into the older part of the city. I think there's a pretty high chance that I'll probably rip that out, but just to complete the episode, I definitely wanted to continue with the plaza. I think it's going to give me options for detailing later on in a further episode, and then we can have a real rethink about how we're going to transition from the old to the even older, right? With the roads, I'm going to really just continue on with what we've already built on, and I'm going to kind of mix things up a little bit. We're going to have a bit of a mix on textures and a bit of a mix on colours as well. So the red roads that you see, we've got a few comments that you don't get red roads in the Netherlands, which I thought was a little bit strange. It's not too hard to find them. Of course, they are used for the bike lanes, but they're also used on the pavement, and they're used on some roads as well. So I'm going to continue in that vein and add them, but we are going to be adding a little bit of variety as we go through and add different neighbourhoods. So although I'm not doing the entire plaza here, I did want to try and still get things connected. Now a quick note on that little extra museum that I sort of slotted in round the back. I found a real nice museum in The Hague called Mauritshuis. Hope I'm doing okay with the pronunciation. I got a little comment chinning me for not pronouncing Coevorden like the Dutch, so I am going to give it a try. I'd put your comment up, by the way, I don't take any offence to it. But the comment just disappeared on YouTube, so I don't know what happened to that. The comment section on YouTube sucks. I don't know why they just change these things. So either way, I'm going to give things a try with the pronunciation. You can roast me in the comments if you like. I don't have any issue with that. But yeah, I think that museum in The Hague is looking real nice. It's obviously not an exact match, but it's not a million miles away, and I think I can work with it. One thing I would like to do though is give it a much more prominent place in that plaza. So I think when we rework that back of the plaza, that's going to be a major part of it, and we will really give it the grandeur it deserves, right? So here's a shot that I promised earlier on, and you can really see just exactly how much ground that we covered there in this episode. Quite a lot. You can see that the housing goes up pretty quick, and we have plenty more to go. And this shot kind of shows really where we are and how that big fancy museum sits slap bang in the middle of the development area today. I think I'm pretty happy with that. I think detailing wise we're looking pretty good. We have plenty more to add though, and let's get cracking with that in fact. Let's talk about bikes. Regular viewers will know that we managed to add bikes into our Ballyhigh build, which is our South Pacific Island build. If you're not familiar with it, playlist is on there. I think it was a couple of episodes back if you want to check out the episode yourself. So Jay made these bad boys in the editor, and then we just set up bus lines, and they pick up a single passenger and they'll go around in a predetermined route. Now that's not really going to be practical in our build today. So although technically we could put them in, I'm not really wanting to use custom assets in this build. I want to try and keep it all through PDX mods as much as I can. It's just going to be a little bit easier for sharing with you guys on Patreon and whatnot. That said, just like the Cape Lomond build, if there's a real exception and I absolutely have to use it, then I'll just jump on it, and I will. Just like the use case for the Formula 1 track, I really wanted to get some cars moving around there, and custom assets were the only way to do that. The other reason not to be using it in this build is that there just won't be enough. In the Netherlands you'd expect a ton of bikes, and really just having a handful of them going round in a predetermined route, I don't think it's really going to do the thing for me, to be honest. Now what I do need to do is have a little look at that dev diary again and try and work out if there's a way of incorporating it for a future build. Now I don't really want to be basing an entire build around something that may or may not be released. I don't know how the final form of that particular product and asset and functionality is going to look, and I'm kind of hesitant of essentially building something that might not work, at the end of the day, and that would be a real waste of time, and it seems a little bit silly. That said, there will be certain parts of this build that just simply need bike lanes. It just won't look right without it. And I'm thinking certain intersections, and especially as we move out of the city, I guess, and we have these dedicated lanes, beside the roads, separate from the roads, essentially as separate networks. They'll look really strange without it. I'm hoping potentially some of the big arterial roads we can just simply change a lane, maybe in Road Builder or maybe vanilla. We'll see what comes out. But certainly for the sort of bike specific networks, probably go a little bit easy on them for just now, and you never know, we might get more information on it later down the line. But either way, it does seem a little bit silly to kind of focus efforts on that just now because it's not in the game, right? Now, one thing I nearly forgot was to come back and speak about that little tram station. Now, here you can see the tram station where we've covered up the petrol pumps, but what I didn't show you was it actually is quite a much larger asset, and I didn't see it as I was focused right in. So here up the top and here down the bottom, you can see the asset stretches all the way down there and all the way up there, and obviously we're left with remnants and random stuff sitting on the tracks. So that get whipped out. In case you're wondering why that's gone in any of the cinematics, if you spot it, that's the reason why. I think worth pointing out while I've got this shot open is that you'll see that the back end of the plaza, so basically anything that's behind the tram station, kept that nice and open, kept that pretty plain. Again, and I think I mentioned earlier on, that's going to be really a starting point for another episode later down the line. So we'll keep it open to interpretation for now, and that'll be a focus for another day. Now, although that's going to be a focus for another day, I'm still going to detail a little bit of it just for my own satisfaction more than anything else. I think leaving it completely plain was just looking a little bit sad, and I couldn't really do that if I'm being completely honest with myself. But that said, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. The other little bits and pieces really is just having a bit of time on the back streets, and mostly it's just about surfaces and making things look a little bit better, a little bit tidier, and again it's going to give me some detailing opportunities for later on. So what I'll do is I'll leave the little bit of detailing that's left on a time lapse, and I'll catch up with you again in just a couple of minutes. So here we're going to have a look at the traffic that I was talking about earlier on. As I said, it's going to be fairly busy later down the line. It's not a huge amount of population that we have in the city already. But what we can do now is have a little look at the city in the winter, just as the fog, I guess, was rolling over the North Sea and onto the lowlands. I think it's going to add a wee bit of atmosphere for the final shots. I reckon the lighting in this is actually really nice, and usually I don't bother with fog too much, but I think a little bit of fog and a little bit of blur in the background actually makes quite a big difference in these shots, and I might be using them a little bit more in the future. So the back of this plaza here is looking pretty dead, and we know why. We haven't really built a huge amount out there. There's not much going on. That is very much a setup for a future episode, remember. All the little bits and pieces that we use for the park I think is blended in quite nice, and having that big green space along with the built environment I think provides a nice contrast, and we'll continue to be adding them as the build goes through. Nice and quiet around the back alleys here, and this is our, again, just pedestrian roads, and hopefully we can maybe add a few bikes depending on what happens later on. So again, a bit of a mix, old and new, and I quite like that courtyard. As I said, it's quite different than the building it's actually based on in real life, but it does give us a little bit of architectural difference, and I think it was worth the time to kind of try and focus on something that does look that little bit older, even if it doesn't necessarily fit directly in with the rest of the build. Remember, that junction is essentially a bit of a gateway to not only the old town or the older part of the city, but also that arterial leading on to what should be a bit of a higher density and actually higher height buildings as well. It's obviously a really large element, that big building there in the bottom right hand corner, and I'd want to sort of gently raise that height as we go along, and I don't quite exactly have it in mind what I'm going to do, and I might well change my mind as well, but we'll see. But that's the plan when I was doing this build. So I think a nice contrast having those big arterials, and then we've got the nice quiet, almost sort of single lane roads here. Again, I'll continue to experiment with parking options, building widths, road widths, to be honest. I think is going to be the main thing to focus on as we build out further neighbourhoods. And again, here and there we'll just slot in a few more buildings, and I think I want to add a little bit of variety. You can see the German building there which kind of stands out, and I think I want a bit more of that and kind of get a bit of a skyline with a little bit more variety, I suppose is the way of saying it. We talked a bit about bikes today and the implications and the considerations that we have for this particular build. If you want to see how we created the mountain bike track with the working bikes with the people on it that we shown earlier on, click on this video below.